Welcome. I am your host, Sam Wins, conservation biologist and science educator with the National Park Service at Cabrillo National Monument. And before we get started with tonight's talk, we just have a few housekeeping and logistic items to go over. Tonight's talk is in a webinar format, which means you will only be able to see the host and panelists' faces. So don't panic if you don't see your friends, all right? This also means that we have a lovely Q&A function for all of your burning questions. Just click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to add your question. If it's not at the bottom of your screen, it might be at the top of your bar. Questions will be queued up in the order that they were received. And when Kristen pauses for questions during the chat and at the Q&A at the end, I will read your questions to her to answer. There are a lot of us here tonight, so please keep your mic muted in order to prevent cross traffic. If you must unmute, to ask a question, please wait for the Q&A at the end. And you can request that Ranger Julianne unmutes your mic for your question in the chat. Ranger Julianne will also be tech support for tonight. So if you're having problems, please message her directly. And you might have noticed that captions are available for tonight's talk. Thanks to our wonderful captionist, Idella, and sponsorship from the Cabrillo National Monument Foundation. If you're interested in seeing closed captions, you can click on the CC at the bottom of your screen, or it might be also on the top bar, depending on your computer. You can also choose to read a transcript, and the link is in the chat. Idella will go ahead and put that link up there in the chat for you. And speaking of sponsors, the Cabrillo National Monument Foundation sponsored this whole event, so big thanks to them. Okay, phew. Now that the housekeeping is over with, let's get to the fun stuff. It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's guest speaker, Dr. Kristen Lear. Kristen has over 15 years of experience protecting bats and sharing her passion with the public. She got her start in bat conservation at the ripe old age of 12 when she built and installed bat houses for her Girl Scout Silver Award project. Since then, she has led bat research and conservation projects in the US, Australia, and Mexico, coordinating international teams and guiding conservation policy for endangered species. Kristen is an award-winning public speaker and science communicator and has shared her story on platforms ranging from podcasts, radio shows, the National Geographic Stage, and CBS's Mission Unstoppable. Kristen holds a BA in zoology from Ohio Wesleyan University and a PhD in integrative conservation from the University of Georgia. She is currently an endangered species intervention specialist, say that 10 times fast, at Bat Conservation International, where she leads a bi-national Agave Restoration Initiative for endangered pollinating bats in the US and Mexico. So without further ado, I give you Dr. Kristen Lear.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I'm very, very excited today to talk about bats and agaves. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart because I spent 6 years during my PhD studying bats and agaves in Northeast Mexico. So we're going to talk a little bit about bats in general, and then delve into pollinating bats, and then some of the work that Bat Conservation International is doing to protect this very tight relationship between bats and agaves. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and we should, let me pull it all up. Sam, everything look good? Awesome. Okay, well, let's get started. Like Sam mentioned, my name is Kristen Lear, and I am from Bat Conservation International, currently working as an endangered species intervention specialist. It is quite a mouthful. But at Bat Conservation International, we are a nonprofit based here in the US, but we work internationally to protect bats and end bat extinctions worldwide. That is our mission. And two of our more specific missions are to implement these endangered species interventions around the world to protect these species from going extinct, and also to restore and protect landscapes at a larger scale for some of these bats that migrate or use a large landscape. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, is the intersection of these two things. So like I mentioned, I've worked with these pollinating bats and agaves for quite a while now. For my PhD work in Northeast Mexico, I was studying the endangered Mexican long-nosed bat and how they feed on agaves and rely on these agave plants for their survival, but also how rural communities in Mexico also harvest and use agaves for many, many important uses. And I was studying the intersection between these and how we can work together to protect agaves for both bats and people. So before we talk a little more about pollinating bats, I want to give a little kind of Bats 101 overview. So there are currently over 1,400 species of bats all around the world. They are the only flying mammal. We hear of flying squirrels, but flying squirrels don't actually fly, they just glide. And bats are really found pretty much anywhere around the world. They're found on every continent except Antarctica, and then also in those kind of extreme polar regions. But there's even bats in Alaska and Siberia, some of these places we might not think of bats being. Now, most of the bats around the world, about 70% of the species, are insectivorous, which means they eat insects. They're eating things like moths. You can see this bat's about to get a tasty moth meal here. Beetles, mosquitoes, and all these other insects that are these prey for these insectivorous bats. However, there are about 100 species of bats around the world that eat nectar. So these are nectarivorous bats. And I love these photos because you can see the diversity of what these bats look like, and they feed on lots of different types of flowers and types of plants. And we're going to learn about just how important these bats are to pollination and to us through their pollination. So when we think about pollinators, most people I know say butterflies and moths, right? We have monarch butterflies, which are the iconic pollinator that we're working to protect across their range. We also have bees, right? Honeybees, but also the many, many species of native bees that pollinate our crops. And then, of course, hummingbirds, right? We put up hummingbird feeders to attract hummingbirds, and they feed on lots of different flowers. So these are kind of the typical answer I get when I ask what kind of animals are pollinators. But bats are also very, very important pollinators for many plants around the world. They're a little bit less known, mostly because they're out at night. It's a bit harder to study bats than it is to study diurnal or daytime animals. So up until recently, we haven't known a lot about bats, but we are learning that they are extremely important pollinators. And they pollinate over 300 different types of plants around the world. So things like bananas, mangoes, avocados, one of my favorites, chocolate, the cacao plant that we use to make chocolate. And then one of my all-time favorites, tequila, that we get from agaves. All of these plants and over 300 more are pollinated by bats. So without bat pollination, we would not have all of these foods that we use, maybe not in our everyday lives for some of these products, but that we enjoy in our lives. And what are these bat pollinated plants? What do they look like? When we typically think of flowers for pollinators, we think of daisies or pretty flowers that attract bees or hummingbirds. But these bat pollinated flowers are a bit different. They tend to be obviously open at night because that's when the bats are out. So they have flowers that provide nectar during the night. They're typically white or pale in color. They're not like the bright red or the bright purple that we'll see from other flowers. They're this paler color. They also produce a lot of nectar because bats eat a lot of nectar. So these flowers, like this cactus here, have copious amounts of nectar inside the flowers for the bats. And they also tend to be a little bit stinkier than some of the other flowers that other pollinators eat from. And that smell helps attract the bats and helps the bats find where those flowers are. Now, when we think about hummingbirds or butterflies, hummingbirds have a really long beak to be able to reach deep inside the flowers. Butterflies have the long proboscis that comes out. So what do bats have to be able to reach that nectar? They don't have beaks, they don't have super long noses like these hummingbirds do. But what they do have is they have these really long tongues that can reach deep inside the flower. And you can see here, if you can see this picture, that pink thing coming out of its mouth, that is this bat's tongue. And some of these nectar feeding species can have a tongue that is 1.5 times the bat's body length. That would be like if we stood up and put our hand in the air, our tongue would go all the way from our fingers to the ground. And that's a huge tongue, but it helps them get deep inside the flower to get that nectar. And I always get asked, where do they put that tongue when they're flying and not using it? They actually have a special kind of cavity in their chest where the tongue goes and kind of rolls up when it's not in use. So it's not just flapping around when they're flying around. Now this video is going to show the tongue of these nectar bats in action. And we can see that there are papilla, kind of like our taste buds in our tongue, that stick out from the tongue, and they erect themselves when the bat is feeding on nectar. And those papilla then help the tongue lap up the nectar into the bat's mouth. So can you see those little spiky things coming off the tongue? Those are the papilla on the tongue. And we're going to see a slow motion of that. So you can see just how those papilla pull up the nectar into the bat's mouth. So there they are, microscopic image. They look kind of creepy. Oh, there goes this slow motion. You see how it pulls up the nectar on the tongue, and that's how they get it into their mouth. So while they can't get all the way with their head, they do get into that flower. And what happens when they're getting into that flower is something we rely on is pollination, like I mentioned. And these bats, in these pictures, you can see the hummingbird versus the bat. And because the bats are not so well adapted as the hummingbirds, they actually tend to get much more covered in pollen on their bodies and their faces, like we can see here, versus the hummingbirds tend to get less covered in pollen. So bats tend to be more effective pollinators, and they spread more pollen than hummingbirds and some of these other pollinators. And hummingbirds are affectionately sometimes called nectar robbers because they are kind of robbing the nectar from the flower without providing that pollination service. But the bats really are getting in there. And bats, like I said, they spread more pollen. Like you can see in this picture, it's covered in pollen on its whole body. And some of these bats are also very long distance flyers. So some of these bat species can fly up to 30 miles or more one way from its roost at night to feed on flowers and then come back to its roost. So sometimes these bats are flying much farther distances than insects, hummingbirds. So they're spreading this pollen over a much wider landscape, and they're helping maintain the genetic diversity of those flowers. So these bats are, again, very, very important for pollination. I want to pause here, and I think we're going to take some questions. So Sam, if you want to read off some questions while we watch this fun video of the bats eating.
Yes, absolutely. So there are a bunch of questions that might be site specific. So I'm not sure if you happen to know about the Coronado Islands off the coast of San Diego. And Mel B wants to know if bats have been observed on the Coronado Islands and other islands off the coast of Baja and Southern California.
Yes, definitely. So in the Cabrillo National Monument, there are 10 species of bats there. And these bats, like I said, can travel pretty far. So they can cross water. And actually, there are some of these nectar feeding bats that I'll talk about later, the lesser long-nosed bat, that live in Baja California. And they actually fly across the peninsula or across the strait into Sonora. So they're very capable of flying these long distances. I'm not sure, Sam, you might know some more local bat species, but they definitely are there.
That's awesome. Claudia would like to know, we have a lot of avocados, but she never sees bats. Do avocados have other pollinators?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So a lot of these plants that I mentioned are bat pollinated also have other pollinators, but sometimes, again, the effectiveness of the pollination is not the same level. That makes sense from the plant's perspective, because if there's a plant that only relies on one type of animal or one species of animal for pollination, if something happens to that species, that plant's in big trouble. So a lot of these plants do have other pollinators, but again, the levels of effectiveness vary. And yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about the nectar bats in Southern California in a little bit.
Excellent. Rachel had a question. She said, you mentioned the plants that bats tend to be attracted to have pale or white flowers. Is there a particular reason for that? Is there something specific to the way that bats see that makes those lighter colored flowers easier to see? Or what is the reason?
That actually is a good question. I'm not 100% sure on the white color, but I think part of it is that because they're nocturnal flowers, color does not play as important of a role as it does during the daytime. So it kind of makes sense that the plant doesn't produce color because it doesn't really need to. But that is a really great question about whether the bats are able to see it better because it's white. Just from my experience being out at night and doing bat research, it is easier to find, like if you lose your jacket on the ground, it's easier to find the jacket if it's a light color than if it's a dark color. So I imagine that could play a role. That is a great question.
Excellent hypothesis there. I like it.
Yeah, right?
Sandra wants to know, and maybe, I know you haven't done research specifically in San Diego or Imperial County, so again, you might not know the answer to this question, but Sandra wants to know if there have been any reports of white nose syndrome in our region.
Great question. So not in Southern California, but there is the fungus that was detected, I believe, 2 winters ago in Northern California. I forget the county, but it's in the northern part of California. I mean, it is spreading. It's in Washington State, California now, northern part. So while it's not there yet in Southern California, it definitely could spread that way. And I'm not sure if we've found any evidence of the actual disease yet in the California area, but we have found low levels of the fungus in Northern California.
That's
yeah,
a bummer.
it is really sad.
Yeah. Claudia wants to know, do agaves have any other pollinators besides bats?
Yes, again, great question. So when we talk about agaves, there are over 250 species of agaves. So there's lots of different types. Some are only open during the day with their nectar. So those are pollinated by things like bees and butterflies, hummingbirds, like I mentioned. There's even some like woodpeckers in Mexico that will eat from the flowers. And I've actually recorded mice, like field mice, climbing up the stalk and eating the nectar. So I'm sure they're spreading the pollen. And then ringtail possums, for example, will climb the stalk and eat. So, I mean, how effective they are at actually spreading pollen to other agaves, I'm not quite sure, but there's definitely lots of other things that eat from agaves.
So I think we're going to do one more question, and then the other 2 questions that are in here we'll save for our next period of Q&A, folks. So don't worry, your questions will get answered. Pam wants to know, how far would a bat fly to get nectar? Do you happen to know how far they've been logged flying? So she was just drawing a conclusion, bringing it back home. I've heard that there are bats in El Cajon who come to Cabrillo at night. That's East South San Diego County, and they come all the way to Cabrillo. So what do you know about that, Kristen?
Yes, so yes, they can fly pretty long distances. These nectar bats, the ones that we're watching right now, they've been clocked at 50 kilometers, 60 kilometers, so 30 to 40 miles foraging. So they, they have a roost, usually a cave for these nectar species, and then they can travel, 40 miles or even more in some cases from their roost to feed. So yes, I would not be surprised. I don't know the distance between those 2 spots, but I would not be surprised if they're making it from there.
Very cool. All right, Kristen. So we're going to pause our questions for now and let Kristen keep on going, but we'll answer some questions later.
Yeah, we'll definitely have lots of time for more questions. Don't worry. Okay, so we've talked about bats kind of in general and some of the pollinating that they do. But what about in the US? There are 3 species of nectarivorous or nectarivorous bats in the United States. These are the 3, and they all look pretty similar. This is here on the left, the Mexican long-nosed bat, which is an endangered species by the IUCN, as well as in the US and Mexico. We have the lesser long-nosed bat here in the middle, which is kind of a really exciting conservation success story because a couple years ago, it was taken off of the US endangered species list because of all the great conservation work that has been going on over the past 20, 30 years. So that's really exciting. It's still under threat, but it's not listed as endangered anymore. And then we have on the right the Mexican long-tongued bat, which is kind of counterintuitive because it has a longer nose than the Mexican long-nosed bat. But that's how it goes. And these ones, the Mexican long-tongued bats, we don't know a ton about them. They don't roost in as big of colonies as these other two species that can roost in 20,000 bats or more. They tend to roost more solitarily or in smaller groups, but it is listed by the IUCN as near threatened. So again, it is definitely under threat. So I just want to show the range map so we can kind of situate ourselves of where we're talking about. This is the Mexican long-nosed bat, the endangered one. And it ranges from central Mexico all the way up to Texas and then a little bit into New Mexico. And that's its migratory range, and they are migratory, which I'll talk about in a minute. This is the lesser long-nosed bat. So this one has a very similar range, but it doesn't quite get into Texas, and it is in Arizona. So these are the ones that if you hear people in Arizona say, oh, I have bats at my hummingbird feeder in like Tucson, that's these ones, the lesser long-nosed bat. As well as the Mexican long-tongued bat. They also are common at these hummingbird feeders in places like Arizona and New Mexico. And this is the species that ranges up into Southern California. So as far as I know, there are no confirmed records of these bats at Cabrillo National Monument, but they do get into the San Diego area. They're not super common, but they definitely get there during the summer. So definitely keep an eye out for them. And like I mentioned, these are the bats that you see people talk about. My hummingbird feeder got drained during the night. What's eating the nectar? Well, that's these bats. These lesser long-nosed bats and these Mexican long-tongued bats are really voracious feeders at these hummingbird feeders. I'm quite jealous. I live in Colorado, so I'm not near any of these areas. Darn, maybe someday. So all three of these species are migratory. So they're migrating from the areas in central Mexico where they mate. They have mating colonies. And then in the spring, the females that are pregnant, they migrate northward up into the US Southwest, the areas that I showed. So yeah, those pregnant females are migrating this very long distance, over 700 miles. And during that time, they're feeding on agaves and on agave nectar. So these agave plants are these towering species of plant. They can grow up to 30 feet tall, so they're huge, and they have tons and tons of nectar. These bats are also eating from like saguaro cactus and cardone cactus species, but agaves are a very important food source for these bats. And like I mentioned, when we talked about pollination, these bats are getting really close into those flowers, getting covered in pollen, like you can see in this picture here. And they're spreading that pollen and helping pollinate those agaves. So these bats help maintain genetic diversity of these agaves, and in turn get this high energy nectar source that powers their migration. And like I mentioned, it's these pregnant, you can see this extremely pregnant female, a lesser long-nosed bat, that migrate up to the northern part of their range. And then they give birth to their young. Typically, these bats have one pup or baby per year, which is very interesting. They only have one baby a year, which is most bats. You can see that gigantic baby latched onto its mom. So these mom bats are in these parts in Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, and Sonora, Mexico. And they're feeding on these agave plants to, again, fuel the migration, but also fuel them while they're raising their baby. Now, when we think about agaves and plants and pollinators, like I mentioned, of course, there are the nectar-feeding bat species. But interestingly, we're finding with more and more research over the past few years, we are finding that there are some of these insectivorous bat species, or the insect-eating species, that also eat nectar from plants like cacti species and agaves. Or these insectivorous bats will hunt, they'll chase insects like moths around those plants that the insects are feeding on. So this is a video of a pallid bat we just saw on the previous slide in Mexico, and it's hunting these insects around the agaves. You can see it's kind of lilting around, but we also recorded them landing on the flowers and drinking nectar. So when we think about pollinators, sometimes these insectivorous bats get even more covered in pollen than some of the nectar bats. So these possibly are even better pollinators sometimes than the nectar bats, which is pretty crazy. And there's lots of great research going on to learn more about insectivorous bats as pollinators. Now on Cabrillo, there are agaves. I'm sure if any of you have been there, you've seen these plants. They're really hard to miss. I've never been out there, but I really want to get out there and see these Shaw's agave because they're beautiful plants. Agaves in general are beautiful, but I like to think these ones especially look like asparagus that are shooting up out of the ground. They look like gigantic asparagus. And these plants, like I said, agaves flower one time in their lives and then they die. And it can take anywhere from 2 to 3 or 5 years to 20 or more years for them to reach maturity and flower. So they're really special plants. And like I mentioned, we don't know yet if there are the Mexican long-tongued bat that gets at these agaves, but they do range into San Diego, and I would not be surprised if eventually they are found feeding at these agaves in Cabrillo. So I know we need definitely more research and more studies to check out the agaves. And in Cabrillo, in California, there are 25 species of bats in general, and in the US, there's 47 species. So California has a very good high diversity of bats across the state. And in Cabrillo National Monument, there are 10 species. And most of these, again, are those insectivorous species. So if you see a bat flying around, the big brown bat here is one of the most common bats across the whole United States, but also in the San Diego area. They're very well adapted to, lights being around people, buildings. So if you see a bat flying around either the monument or your house in the area, it very well could be a big brown bat. The California myotis that we have here is also a very common species in the area. And they're very commonly found hunting around water. So, streams or lakes, they hunt, insects at these areas. And then the Mexican free-tailed bat, which is one of my favorite bats of all time. They are, again, a very, very common bat in the area, and they're very well adapted to people. If you've ever heard of Congress Avenue Bridge in Austin, Texas, or Bracken Cave in Texas, those are the areas that have these bats, these Mexican free-tailed bats. And in the Congress Avenue Bridge, there's 1.5 million Mexican free-tailed bats every summer that roost underneath the bridge in the middle of Austin, which is pretty cool. And if you ever get a chance to go check that bridge out, definitely do it. So one more pause for questions before we go on and learn more about the agave restoration work that we're doing at BCI. Oh, I think you're on mute, Sam.
I double-clicked it. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
A sensitive touchpad. All right, so many great questions in the Q&A. So Melody wants to know, where do bats sleep, specifically in the Southern California and Baja California region?
Great question. So, a lot of bats roost in caves. That's kind of the stereotype, right, that we think of bats roosting in caves. But I believe only about 50% of the bats in California roost in caves. The rest are roosting in places like cracks in rock, rock crevices, on cliff faces. They roost in trees, either in tree hollows or just hanging from tree leaves outside on the branches. Some of them also roost under tree bark. There's some tree species that have the bark that kind of peels away, and those bats can roost under there. And then, like I mentioned, the big brown bat and several other species can roost in buildings, in attics, under bridges, So yeah, kind of a very diverse array of roost sites.
Super adaptable.
They are.
Warren would like to know, what is the white nose syndrome?
I'm glad somebody asked that. So yeah, white nose syndrome is a devastating disease that is caused by a fungus that grows on the bat's skin when they're hibernating. So, bats go into hibernation, not all bats, but in cold areas, a lot of times they'll go into hibernation. And they lower their body temperature, their metabolism for the winter. But with white nose syndrome, the fungus grows on their skin, on their noses, and it kind of irritates their skin, so it wakes them up from hibernation. And then when they're woken up, they get hungry, so they fly outside a cave or their roost to look for food. And if you're in somewhere like New York State, it's really cold, there's lots of snow, there's no insects. So the bats will either freeze to death or they'll starve to death. So this fungus it started in New York State in 2006. We think it was introduced to the United States. We think from either Europe or Asia by a person on somebody's caving gear or shoes or something, and it was introduced to one cave in New York State in 2006. And since then, it has spread from New York State all the way westward across the U.S. Up into Canada, and it's killed millions and millions of bats since then. So it's a devastating disease, and there's a lot of research going into, can we treat the bats? Can we kill the fungus? What can we do to help the bats?
Pam wants to know, what does the future look like for the disease? Is there any breaking conservation news coming out of the lab about what can be done for white nose syndrome?
Yes, so kind of two things. There's a lot of work going now into treatments, like I mentioned. This fungus is a cold-loving fungus, so it grows best in cold, caves. So we're trying to see, can we use treatments, either bacteria, other fungi, other organisms that will kill the fungus inside the caves without harming the other organisms inside the cave. Can we vaccinate the bats themselves? There's research into that. And then the second thing is some bats do survive getting it. And so there is evidence that some bats might have some immunity to it. And so the hope is that over time, those bats will pass that on to their offspring and eventually become immune to the fungus. So there is hope. It's a slow road, but there is hope.
Hopefully they'll evolve an immunity there. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Judy would like to know, how big are bats? So what's
I love this question? Yeah, so there's the most of the bats in the U.S. are pretty small. They're, I don't know, half the size of your palm. They're not too big. But the smallest bat in the world is called the bumblebee bat, found in Thailand. And it's called the bumblebee bat because it's about the size of your thumb tip. So just the tip of your thumb. And they weigh less than a penny. And then the biggest bat is one of the flying foxes that has a 6-foot wingspan. But they only weigh about 2 pounds. So even though they have really big wings, they don't weigh too much. And don't worry, those big bats are fruit bats, so they only eat fruit. And then everything in between.
That's incredible. Jose would like to know, you mentioned that agaves are critical for pregnant and lactating females. Do other plants offer critical support for bats, or are agaves exceptionally supportive for nectarivorous bats compared to other plants?
Great question. So remember I showed those range maps of the bats? So the bats that are the lesser long-nosed bats that go up into Arizona and New Mexico and Sonora, Mexico, there are cactus species there. You have the giant saguaro cacti that have the big flowers. So for those lesser long-nosed bats, they can also eat from those cactus species. But the Mexican long-nosed bat, the one that's endangered, they don't range into Arizona at all. And so they're only in like northeast Mexico and Texas, and there are no cactus species there that offer big flowers for the bats. So in that area, for that species, it's only agaves that they're feeding from when they're pregnant and lactating. So that's one of the reasons why the Mexican long-nosed bat is endangered. Great question.
All right. You were going to get this question, and I hope you're ready. Because it's
Oh, I know what it is.
yeah, it's on everybody's mind right now. All right. So, how did coronavirus start and where did it come from? And was it really Wuhan's animal market, like the wet markets? And did it originate from bats? So, there's many parts to that. And maybe
Yes.
this question.
Basically, the short answer is we don't know 100% yet where it came from. With viruses, it's really hard to pinpoint exactly, which species of animal it came from or what location it came from. So there's still a lot of research going on into that. But the evidence does suggest that it came from either the virus itself or an ancestor of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, came from a horseshoe bat in China, which is a horseshoe bat is a type of bat, a species of bat. And so it does look like it could have come from there and potentially jumped into another animal like a pangolin, which is a spiny anteater, before then jumping to people. But again, we don't really know exactly how that progression happened. But the thing I want to stress is that, of course, bats, just like any other wild animal, including us, can carry diseases. We have the herpes virus that can cause cold sores. We can spread that around. There's all of these viruses and diseases that animals can have, and that is natural. The problem that happens is when we get into close contact with these wild animals that we wouldn't normally be in contact with. That's when the problems occur. Just being around bats or wild animals, like having bats flying around your yard, that is not a problem. It's when we handle bats, when we eat animals, that we can get these diseases. And again, we don't know if it came from like the market. It very likely could have because of the kind of conditions that are in these markets sometimes, where lots of animals are put together, wild animals that wouldn't normally interact in the wild. They can spread, viruses among each other that can then jump to us. So yeah, it's a big area of research. And I do want to stress that, again, it's these interactions when we cut down, roost sites for bats, when we encroach on wildlife's habitat, that's when these interactions start happening more and more. And the chances for viruses to jump to people increases. And I do also want to stress that, we hunt animals here in the US, right? We hunt deer, turkey, lots of different things. So it's not the fact of hunting necessarily, it's the kind of the practices that we use. We should always be using proper cleaning and cooking, right? When we're handling, wearing gloves if we're handling these animals. So it's a very complex issue, but I hope that helped in a nutshell.
Yes, thank you very much for clearing that up a bit. All right, we're going to continue with Kristen's talk, and then we'll have some time for more Q&A at the end. Take it away, Kristen.
Awesome. Okay, well, talking about people, that was actually a great segue into the next section. I want to talk about agaves and people, because agaves are not just important for these bats, they're also critical resources for people, particularly in Mexico. So this was a lot of the work that I did for my PhD, studying how people are using agaves in these areas. I was, again, working in Northeast Mexico. But in a nutshell, agaves are life for some of these people in these communities. We have these products from the sugar or the sap of the base of the plant. These are very sugar-rich plants before they shoot up that flowering stalk. And so we get things like pulque and agua miel that we can make into syrup. If you've ever gone to the store and seen agave syrup, that's from these plants. And then of course we have the distilled beverages from these products. So tequila and mezcal are the most famous of these products, but also bacanora, sotol are also other agave liquor products. We have these stalks. Remember I showed the big asparagus looking stalk? Sometimes people cut down the stalk before the flowers open, and because it's a really sugar-rich stalk, and then they cook it and they eat it, kind of like sugar cane. It's kind of like a candy. People also cut down and use the stalks, like you can see here, as fences or to construct houses in the communities. We have you can see here, the stalks and the flowers and the leaves are also cut down to feed livestock like cattle and goats and sheep. You can see this all this stuff here is chopped up agave leaves that they chopped up to feed to their cattle as a forage source. And then agaves, like the whole agaves themselves, can also be planted and used as living fences. You can see here, this is a property line. And so these agaves are planted to delineate property boundaries. And then also to keep pigs, especially out of crops. So these agaves are used to protect crops. And then they're also planted on like roadsides or on hill slopes to prevent erosion. Because again, they're really good. They have really good root systems that help prevent soil erosion. And in general, agaves are just beautiful, iconic parts of the landscapes across the US Southwest and Mexico. I mean, how can you not love these plants? They're gorgeous. They offer so many products to people, and again, so much food and resources to animals like bats. Now, unfortunately, a lot of agave habitat across Mexico and the US Southwest is decreasing from things like agriculture. We clear areas to put crops, ranching, the livestock can eat, again, like I showed, can eat the stalks sometimes on their own. People sometimes can harvest wild agave populations to depletion. It can be done sustainably, but sometimes it's not. And then of course, development, building of communities or houses and expanding development is all leading to agave habitat loss across the range of these bats across Mexico and the US Southwest. And as an example, I mentioned the Mexican long-nosed bat as the endangered species, and they're increasingly under threat from this loss of their foraging resources. So within the past few generations of the Mexican long-nosed bat, so within the past about 50 years or so, about 50% of the population of this bat has gone away. It's disappeared. So we're rapidly losing this species. And that is why our Agave Restoration Initiative at Bat Conservation International is focusing on restoring these agaves to the landscape across the migratory route of the bats, as well as around their sites, the roost caves where they live. And the idea with our Agave Restoration Initiative is that this is not just for the bats. We're also trying to restore agaves to the landscape for people so that people can continue using agaves for all of those uses that we talked about before. And we're really trying to create this climate resilient nectar corridor for these bats, and also to support people's livelihoods. So just showing this map again, we can see the range of the bats. And then these red stars are some of the areas where we're working. So we're doing a lot of work in Northeast Mexico, as well as Sonora, Mexico, and then also in Arizona and New Mexico. And we're starting to work in Texas too, to again, restore agaves to these areas that have been depleted. And this initiative really is a binational collaborative involving lots of different researchers, government agencies, nonprofit organizations, communities, and industry, including mining industries, for example. All of these folks are helping at this landscape scale, because we can't just restore and plant agaves in one spot. We really have to think of it as a corridor for these bats. And so these are just some of our partners, and you can see it runs the gamut from communities to NGOs to private industries, and the National Park Service is one of our partners, which is, they were one of our original partners in Arizona, which is really exciting. So for our initiative, there's kind of two main strategies that we're thinking about. One is that we want to plant, our goal is at least 100,000 native agave plants to plant across this whole area for the bats and the people to continue using. So that's one strategy, is planting these native agaves. The other strategy is to protect these current high density stands of agaves where they already are thriving. Like I mentioned, these current stands of agaves are under threat from things like ranching, agricultural development. And so we want to protect some of these key areas in that migratory pathway for the bats and near the communities so that they can continue using them to some extent for their uses, while also letting some of the agaves flower for the bats. And again, this is a very collaborative effort that needs strong partnerships across the range of partners that we're working with. And I'm going to talk about some of our achievements to date because we're really proud of what we've been doing over the past 2 to 3 years and where we're going next. So what have we achieved? What have we been doing with our Agave initiative? Well, the first thing, like I mentioned, is we want to plant native agave seeds. Sometimes you can collect the baby agaves from a stand and transplant those to new areas. But we also want to think about the genetic diversity of these agaves. So we want to also propagate and grow agaves from seeds that we collect from these healthy agaves. So that's what you can see here. These pictures in this video is showing how we collect agave seeds. It's a pretty non-technical method. You kind of like whack the stalk of the plant and you collect these little seeds. And then, so we've done seed collections across US, again, Arizona and New Mexico, and then in Mexico. And we've collected over 150,000 seeds that we are then propagating in these nurseries. So we've supported nurseries or greenhouses in Arizona and also the development of new greenhouses and nurseries in some of these rural Mexican communities. So this is something really exciting for us because it allows the communities to be very involved, and it's a community approach to doing this work. And it's not just us coming in, here's a plant, go plant it. We have over 20,000 agave plants growing currently, again, across that range. And you can see the cute little baby agaves. They're very small when they start, but then they grow into these gigantic plants. And those will eventually be ready for outplanting in sites that we deem good for the bats and good for people. And to date, we have planted over 15,000 plants in these areas for the bats. And like I mentioned, a lot of different partners, the National Park Service at Coronado National Monument, or Memorial, excuse me, state lands, mining companies and corporations, and the communities, and many others have participated in this. I really like these photos. This is one of the mining companies, Freeport-McMoRan, that we've been working with. And they salvage agaves from mining sites that they're going to be clearing out. We work with them to collect those agaves before they clear them. And then you can take those agaves and truck them to a new site that's good for the bats and plant them there and create a new agave location. And then the company gets this really cool bat site that they can put at their headquarters or at the site to show that they're part of this Agave Restoration Initiative. And some of those numbers broken down, we've had over 4,000 planted in Arizona and New Mexico, 1,600 in Sonora, Mexico, so northwest Mexico, and then over 10,000 in northeast Mexico. So we're really proud of this, but we still have a long way to go. And part of the work that we're doing is, like I said, we're not just planting agaves, we're also creating protected areas for agaves to flourish. So we've been working really closely with Mexican communities, the ejidos in northeast Mexico, to fence off, you can see fencing off these areas, and then planting the agaves within those areas, but also those areas can be used for agriculture for the communities. They can plant their agricultural crops, and they can then use that fenced area to grow whatever they need for their own community. So that's something we're really excited about that we've been working with, not just planting agaves, but also supporting these sustainable agricultural practices. We've been doing trainings with these rural ejidos in Mexico from 5 different communities, again, providing training on sustainable agricultural and grazing techniques, as well as helping with soil and water improvements for their agricultural fields. And this is one of our partners, Especie Sociedad y Habitat in Monterrey, Mexico, and they have this really cool alas que siembran esperanza, wings that grow hope, basically in English. And they've been doing this great community-based work. We've also had 11 community agreements signed with these rural communities. These are 10-year conservation agreements for us to work together for a 10-year period, at least, because again, these agaves take 2 to 8 years to eventually flower. So it's really exciting to have these long-term commitments from these communities. Another really cool thing that we've been partnering with a group in Sonora called Colectivo Sonora Silvestre and another group in Arizona called Borderlands Restoration Network. They have actually created this bat-friendly bacanora label. And if you don't know what bacanora is, it's basically like tequila, but it's from Sonora, Mexico. So it's a liquor made from agaves, and these groups have partnered with the Bacanora Regulatory Council in Mexico to create this bat-friendly, sustainable label that they can put on Bacanora bottles to show that these farmers let 2% of their agave crop flower to feed these bats. So it's a really cool initiative. And I don't know if the labels have been produced yet because they're at the early stages, but this is a really exciting thing that in a couple of years, look out for bat-friendly bacanora. And then related to that, this is based off of some work with bat-friendly tequila and mezcal that was started a few years ago by Rodrigo Medellin and the Tequila Interchange Project. And they worked in southern and central Mexico with mezcal and tequila producers to, again, leave, in this case, 5% of their crop to flower for the bats. And then those producers get this cool little sticker label that goes on their bottles and to signify we are bat friendly, we helped these bats. There are websites there to check out if you're interested in learning more about this bat friendly initiative. And then of course, a large part of our work in Mexico, but also the US, is education. A lot of people still have misunderstandings about bats. There is still fear sometimes around bats. That attitude is changing, which is really exciting to see, but education is a big part of our work. So we've led over 20 workshops with our partners, and they've led their own workshops, reaching over 2,000 people across this area where we're working. And these workshops are for kids. You can see this fun workshop where they actually built bat wings and bat masks, and they got to fly around like bats. But it's also for adults, for college students, and for these farmers and communities. So it runs the gamut, and we're really excited about all of these fun educational workshops that we've done. So what's next? Like I said, we're a couple years into this Agave Restoration Initiative, but there's still a long way to go. One of the things that we're working on is to expand our restoration efforts to new areas. We know that these bats roost in other spots in the places where we're working, so we want to make sure to restore agaves to those areas too. So we're working on getting in touch with and partnering with additional communities and landowners, including in Texas, which is a whole new spot for us in Western Texas. We are working particularly in Mexico, but also in the US, to establish government agreements, again, for planting on government lands, but also to do things like maintain seed banks for these agave seeds that we collect, so that there's a long-term genetic population that we can pull from in the future to plant these agaves. We're also really, really excited to begin supporting local agave enterprises. You can see this picture here is a community group of women in Northeast Mexico, and they make all these agave products and other things and sell them at local or regional markets. So we want to work with them, and they're very interested in doing these sustainable bat-friendly agave management practices and being able to sell their products as bat-friendly. So we're working to get that off the ground. And then finally, we are working to expand our restoration efforts to address larger societal issues such as food security and climate change mitigation. I mentioned those greenhouses in the communities. Our goal is that those greenhouses and nurseries can be used by the communities to plant vegetables, medicinal plants, or other community plants of interest that they can then use or sell on local markets. And then climate change, agaves do sequester carbon. And there's a great initiative in Mexico that's looking at planting agaves to help sequester carbon and help reduce climate change effects. So we are working through our initiative to try to push that in different areas and get those efforts off the ground. So ultimately, these agaves are an amazing, amazing plant. And the relationship between the agaves, the bats, and the people is one that is very interconnected. And through the work that we're doing, we're really trying to support this relationship so that the bats benefit, the people benefit, and the agaves benefit. If you'd like any more information about this initiative, we have on our website, we have some information about some of our partners and the initiative as a whole. So feel free to check it out at that site. And we can, I'm sure, share these later in the chat. And then, yeah, find us online, batcon.org. We're on social media too, and so am I. So we'd love to hear from you, and yeah, we'd love for you to get involved. So I think we have time for some questions.
So we're just about out of time, but if you have a few extra minutes, Kristen, are you willing to wait around? A bunch of questions came in while you were chatting, and I want to make sure we
yes,
see that here. Thank you so much for hanging around. But I am going to share my screen really quickly here.
Let me stop sharing mine.
All right, because friends, got some exciting news. Oop. It's Pollinator Palooza. Well, what is that? So friends, this is a 6-month celebration of all things plants and pollinators at Cabrillo National Monument. And this was the kickoff event for it. So not only are we having free public talks like this one, the next public talk is going to be April 12th by Dr. James Hung. He's an entomologist and native bee expert. But we're also doing a 6-month-long bio blitz where you can do community science at Cabrillo National Monument. You can see the steps of how to get involved here. And all of this information will be on our website. So I encourage you to check that out. Okay, well, now that I have plugged Pollinator Palooza, let's get to some of these awesome questions for Kristen here. Okay, can you speak to the difference in plants pollinated by flying bats versus those that can walk? Is there a difference in impact to landscapes?
That's a good question. So there actually are some species of bats that can walk. Vampire bats are some of the most common ones that can actually walk or run. But most bat species, when they're on the ground, they can kind of crawl, but they don't walk very well. So yeah, all the ones that are eating from agaves are the ones that fly. And again, those ones that can fly really long distances. So they can spread the pollen and basically the genetic diversity across a larger landscape. Yeah, it's a good question though about the walking.
Yeah, I've never even considered that before. Super interesting. Andrew would like to know if there is some sort of stressor noticed with climate change and possible phenological mismatch with blooming agave. And maybe you can define what phenological mismatch for those who aren't familiar with that term.
Yes, you hit the nail on the head with that. Yes, there are definitely some issues with climate change and these pollinator relationships. So the phenological mismatch is basically the timing of things. So the phenology of the agaves when the flowers open, and the phenology of the bats when they're migrating through an area. And obviously they've co-evolved to open at the same time, right? The agaves are opening in the spring and summer and sometimes into the fall, and that's when the bats are migrating through. But with climate change, what we are seeing is that places are getting a lot of times hotter and places are getting drier. So those deserts where these agaves are, they're undergoing a lot of drought. And so with drought, the agaves don't flower as much, and then they don't flower as early. They can flower earlier or later. So that's the problem when the bats are migrating, because the bats need to hit the agaves when they have open flowers. And if they are out of sync, there's no food for the bats. And then the agaves don't get pollinated. So yes, that is a big concern with climate change. And we are trying to address that in our restoration efforts to account for those potential changes, but it is really hard.
And kind of like a secondary effect of climate change, are there shrinking ranges for any of these agave plants? Have you noticed? Is there?
Yeah, so we think, it's like the upwards, basically, the elevation. So, there's a lot of agaves that are found in mountain ranges. And so, we have seen this happen with other organisms, and it's likely to happen with agaves, is that they stop being able to grow at the lower elevations where it's hotter and drier, and the ranges shrink to like the tops of the mountains. Yeah, so that is definitely an elevational concern too.
The climate change is affecting them in a variety of ways.
Yes, it is.
Judy would like to know something about, she noticed that there were both white and black seeds when you were showing the agave seeds. Is there a difference between the white and black seeds?
Yeah, great observation. Yes, so the black seeds are the fertilized ones, and the white seeds are ones that did not get fertilized. And that's actually how you can tell pollinator effectiveness. So you can see if an agave got really well pollinated, because like almost all of the seeds will be black. If it didn't get pollinated, hardly any of the seeds will be black. Yeah, that's a great observation.
Very good. And speaking of seeds, Bob would like to know, if we collect seeds from our agave plants in Arizona, where can we donate them?
Oh, where are you in Arizona? Are you Phoenix or probably Tucson?
Bob, I see you've been typing in the chat, so I know you're chat capable. If you want to just type your response into the chat, that would be excellent. He says Phoenix.
Awesome, Phoenix. Yeah, so the bats aren't, well, quite up to the Phoenix area yet. But like I said, with climate change, who knows? They might be expanding northward. But definitely reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat, and we can chat more afterwards, because obviously there's a lot of work that we're trying to do to collect seeds from a variety of different areas while still maintaining the areas that are suitable for the agaves. So definitely hit me up on the email.
He says he's linked to you on Twitter already, so he'll connect with you there, it looks like. Warren would like to know where the agaves that you guys are restoring with, where are they coming from? And is there any genetic diversity on what's being planted?
Yeah, great question. So we try to maintain the area where we collected the seeds from. So we make sure to collect seeds from different areas, but then when we go and plant those seeds later, we make sure to keep track in the greenhouses where those plants came from, and then we plant them back in that same general area. That makes sense because those agaves, those plants are adapted to that area. Mm-hmm. But there's also in restoration, there's also the idea of adding in some genetic diversity and like a mix, right? Maybe you should bring some agaves that are a little more adapted to the desert and bring it in a little bit to an area that's not quite deserty yet, to again account for potential changes from climate. Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of that debate in ecological restoration of, are we playing God? Are we, bringing in new genes that shouldn't be there, or should we actually be doing that? So that's something we're definitely aware of and we're trying to account for. But we're still learning. So this is something we're definitely still learning about.
Yeah, that is a tough question, right? Are you introducing something that is non-native by doing that, right? The agaves that wouldn't necessarily be there right now? Yeah, good question.
Yeah.
Kind of a follow-up, Claudia would like to know, are you doing agave restoration in San Diego at all? And if yes, how can she get involved?
So not yet. So we are not working in California. And I don't know if we have any soon plans to. But that is a good question, because these bats are in Baja, right? They're in Sonora. They do come up there. So maybe in the future it would be good to do some restoration there. But definitely, if you have agaves, keep them in your yard and make sure they bloom and stay healthy. And if you can, try to avoid using pesticides on the plants. That's always a good thing. But yeah, because you never know, you might actually someday see one of those long-tongued bats there.
You kind of addressed this a little bit ago, but are there any biosecurity risks when relocating agave plants?
Ooh, yes, actually. That's a really interesting question.
Also
Yeah.
define that a little bit. What do they mean by biosecurity risk? Because I know some of us may not know the answer to that.
Yeah, so are you talking in terms of like the plants themselves or in terms of people? I'll talk about in plants. You can put in the chat to clarify. But in terms of the plants, yes. So we're actually working in Big Bend National Park, so with the Park Service, to hopefully do some restoration around one of the main bat roosts there. But they, want to make sure that we're not bringing in outside plants into the park. So yes, because you can bring in, if you grow agaves or any plant in a nursery, you can get like fungus or bacteria or who knows what on those plants inside the nursery. And then if you take those out and plant them in the wild, that could introduce some pests or diseases to the wild populations. So yes, we are definitely aware of that and trying to avoid doing that. And that's why we try to keep things as local as possible when we do these restorations.
Let's take one more question.
Mm-hmm.
What is the evolutionary purpose of the proboscis on the tip of the Mexican long-nosed bat? And she says, I think that's the right species.
Yeah, so they have like the long tongue and the little, yeah, so they have, like I said, I think we showed that video of the papilla and the tongue that goes down. And basically the function of that is to collect the nectar when they're lapping it up, because they can't get, their face all the way into the flower. So those protrusions can help collect the nectar on the tongue that they then put back into their mouth. Does that answer, did that answer the question?
Yeah, I think maybe the little snub nose.
Oh my gosh, the leaf nose. I'm sorry. Yes.
Nose. Yeah.
Yes, good question. So yeah, it's called a little leaf nose, and they're leaf-nosed bats. And they have that, it looks like a little, like a little leaf on its nose. And so these bats echolocate. So the leaf nose helps with echolocation. It helps direct the echolocation call so that they can kind of have a directional call. And they do move. If you ever Google, videos of these bats, they like, their little noses can kind of like swivel around. It's pretty cute.
I know what I'm doing when we finish tonight.
All right. They're really cute.
Videos of that. All right. So folks, if you could just hang with me one more minute, I want to turn it over to Emily Moore, Executive Director of the Cabrillo National Monument Foundation, for our closing remarks, and then we're wrapping it up. Emily, go for it.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Kristen and Sam and Julianne. It was really, really fascinating. I knew nothing about bats, and so this was absolutely incredible. So thank you so much. And for all of you, I hope if you really enjoyed this Naturally Speaking program today, we encourage you to continue your support and join our foundation. We were a proud sponsor of today's virtual event. And from members and donors like you, we are able to fund programs like this, as well as we fund youth education programs and camps, volunteer support and training, and so much more. And on May 22nd, we are hosting Cabrillo for the Stars. It's a free virtual event experience where we encourage you to wear comfy clothes, but you have to bring your national park spirit. And the event is such a great opportunity to learn more about what we fund and about our supporters, and we'll provide some entertainment as well. So thank you for joining us this evening, and we look forward to you hopefully joining our foundation family and seeing you at these other events.
And that's it for tonight. Thank you all so much for joining us. We did record tonight's event, and it will be up on our website at some point in the future. I can't tell you exactly when, but sometime soon. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you.
Our wonderful captioner. Thank you for your assistance, Julianne and Emily. Good night, everyone.
Night.